Hi, everyone. Welcome to another one of the mini lectures for international organizations. I hope you all are doing well. Thank you for your submissions for your most recent assignments. And remember to complete the assignments that are associated with this upcoming section and current section, I should say, on sports as international organizations. You may notice that I am joined by a very special guest today. If you look over my right shoulder, you will see in the background our one Siamese cat, Kai. He is resting delightfully in our little hanging chair back there. And he may wake up during this and be quite vocal and make more of an appearance. But if not, enjoy the serenity of a sleeping cat in the background. So if it sounds as if I'm whispering, it is because everything in this house revolves around the happiness of that cat. So he is very special and likes to remind us of this frequently. He's a very sweet boy. I hope everybody, like I said, is doing well. I hope you're making do. For those of you who are in Austin, obviously the shelter-in-place order has been extended to May 8th. From a university standpoint, all of our classes have been transitioned online for the summer. So for any of you who are taking summer courses, that's something to be aware of, obviously. And I think optimistically, all of us on the Hilltop are still planning on coming back to face-to-face in the fall, but obviously that's something we'll just have to continue to see. That being said, I encourage you to complete the survey that's out right now. That you've been sent email reminders about related to the COVID-19 survey. And it's important that we understand where you are right now with your lives in terms of what are the stressors that you're feeling, what are the problems that you're facing, what are the dilemmas that you and your family are facing together. We can't solve everybody's problem, but we can at least try to point you towards the proper resources and make sure that your voice is heard and make sure that your concerns are heard. We do care deeply about you and want to make sure that you're being looked after as best as possible, even though you're not on campus. So, with that being said, I hope everything's going well. And let's dive into this section. So this section, I wanted to do something a little bit special just because we had a short week because of the Easter holiday and then your big assignments being due on Tuesday. So I didn't post any new material until Wednesday. And so this was a section that I was planning on actually teaching in a face-to-face setting as well. So it's not something that I've changed for the course. Maybe we've tilted it a little bit because of the pandemic and some of the topic is a little bit changed. But the essence of it is really what I wanted to talk about, which was sports as a driving multinational corporation. I think a lot of times when we think of multinationals, we think of ExxonMobil and Apple and IBM and sports-related MNCs, something like Nike or Reebok or Adidas. So we do think of sports in that context, but we rarely ever think of sports, the actual league of sports, as a multinational corporation. But I think it's important to think about that. And I think it's important to understand how these sports leagues function and how they function largely a lot like what we would consider to be traditional multinational corporations and how influential they have become over the last 15 to 20 years. I think that's the other part of this. And maybe some of you are actually, I think people your age this might be more intuitive for some people who are your age, because you've come of age where there are $100 million salaries in every sport, and that's just normal. Whereas somebody who's my age, I remember growing up and sports, yes, players got paid, but not to the level that they're getting paid now, not even when controlling for inflation. So we've really seen this huge expansion of sports as a political, social, cultural influence in the world. And I think it's important to understand them in international organizations because they are truly international entities that are influencing the politics and economics of the world that we're around. Before we get too far in, though, I want to give a very quick shout out to this week's winner, because we can already say this week's winner of the UNESCO World Heritage Challenge, Alessandra Urbina. So, Alessandra, good job correctly identifying the newest UNESCO World Heritage Site Suomenlinna Fortress, which is off the coast of Helsinki, Sweden, or Helsinki, Finland, I should say. My wife and I visited there back in 2016, I believe. It was actually quite delightful. We were staying in Tallinn, Estonia, and you just take like an hour and a half boat and you're in Helsinki. And then Suomenlinna is this island fortress that's off the coast of Helsinki. And it's quite stunning. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful kind of island. It's not just the fortress. It's not like if any of you've ever visited like Fort McHenry in Maryland, Baltimore, where like the island is the fort. It's more of like there's a fort, but then there's a much larger island that's there. Very few people live there. I actually don't think anybody lives there permanently, but people go there. But there was like a coffee shop, just very quaintly, in this kind of grassy knoll area. So it's a beautiful place. And lovely people. So if you ever have the opportunity to travel to Scandinavia, and Finland specifically, make sure to check out Suomenlinna. Okay, so sports is multinational, and this is where I think there's always been a big focus of the impact of sports on politics. And I think honestly, the last 2 or 3 years has been Exhibit A for that. We've always seen that. Colin Kaepernick and his disputes with the NFL, taking a knee, protesting racial injustice and police brutality. And then suddenly this becomes this huge political hot potato and political issue that various people have tried to capitalize on over the last 2 to 3 years. So, like I said, it's always been there, though. But for the purpose of this course, it's interesting to look at those intersections of sport and politics on an international stage. So in particular, the Olympics have kind of served as that vehicle, that platform for social political statements to be made by foreign entities. So the Berlin Olympics of 1936, very famously, Jesse Owens, the American Olympian athlete, African American, just absolutely demolished the field in the 100-meter dash in front of Adolf Hitler, who had been trying to use propaganda to show the supremacy of the Aryan white race. And yet you have this African American from the United States coming and winning all of these gold medals in all of these track and field competitions, the most important competitions a lot of times in terms of visibility and, the fastest man in the world moniker. And so it is, that was kind of the first time you really saw the entanglement of politics and sports in a really overt way of kind of countries trying to push agendas on an international stage, and sports being an avenue for other people to push back against that and to really repel this idea of a supreme race. Fast forward 32 years, you had the Mexico City Games in Mexico City, and you had the Olympic Games there. John Carlos and Tommy Smith finished first and third in the 100-meter dash for the United States, and raised their fists and above their heads in solidarity during the playing of the national anthem to again bring awareness to racial injustice and the racial fight that was taking place in the 1960s in the United States. That was quite interesting. I mean, again, it brought a lot of eyeballs and a lot of attention to what was going on in the United States at that time, to the rest of the world and to the rest of the world community. So, again, kind of, you've seen this a few times. So what's interesting, though, is while you've seen those social protests and that sports has been a place for those, the last 30 years in particular, really the last maybe even 10 to 20 years, the sports world has just absolutely ballooned in terms of economic wealth and influence. And with that, political and social influence. And so if we think about sports in a 1990s mindset, this won't make any sense. But if you think about sports in 2020, the economic, political, and cultural influence of those organizations and those entities is unlike anything we've ever seen from that sector before, okay? So a countries from around the world, regions from around the world, are putting in huge, lucrative bids to host these sporting events. The Olympics and the World Cup for soccer being the two most prominent. And I say here regions because it's now gotten so big that a lot of these bids to host these major sporting events are not just located in one country, but rather located in multiple countries. So the bid the United States put in to host the World Cup that I believe was rejected actually, but they were looking at North America as an entity to host it. So it wouldn't just be in the United States, but it would be in Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And so trying to share that, responsibility and share the profits, hopefully, from hosting these types of events. So it's something that in Europe, you do see the EU getting involved in the bids to host various Olympic Games. You had obviously you had London hosting the Summer Olympics in 2012, but future Olympic bids, future World Cup bids. You're looking at this at an international level, and not just one country trying to do it, but multiple sets of countries trying to work together. International organizations like the EU, like the African Union, like ASEAN, putting together and working collectively to put forth bids to host these sporting competitions. So this just goes to show you the kind of ever increasing costs of hosting these Olympic Games. And this is one of the, I think, really big stories that if people are interested in this intersection of sports and politics, it's quite interesting to see how expensive hosting these Olympic Games has become. The cost of building the infrastructure to put forth and to host these games is really massive. You see here Sochi, which was in Russia back in 2014, hosting the Olympics, huge cost. And that was largely because Sochi was a nothing city. It didn't have the capacity to host these types of games. And so you really had to build up the infrastructure, all of the sporting arenas, all of the housing, and all of the restaurants, and all of the hotels to host the people in Sochi. You had to build all of that up from scratch. And while certainly places like London and Barcelona and Moscow and other cities still had extravagant costs, in Beijing as well, most recently in 2018, or in 2008, I should say, those countries are a little bit more established. They have infrastructure. Yes, they might need to build new arenas, but ultimately they have the basic infrastructure to host these types of events in place. Whereas Rio or Sochi, there just isn't those basic infrastructures there. So it's a hugely costly endeavor to host these games. So where does the money ultimately come from for this? A lot of it comes from television and licensing, from the standpoint of sponsorship and television rights, and how much in the United States, NBC, which is the corporate media sponsor of the Olympics, how much money NBC is giving to have the rights to air the Olympics and live. I think their latest bid was over $1 billion over a period of, I think, 30 years or something like that. And so, these huge astronomical bids. So this is where their money is coming from. How much that money ends up making it back to the host city, that's actually one of the big problems, is that it doesn't. It really goes to the IOC, and how the IOC then divvies that out, I think, has been a matter of a lot of corruption. And this is where I think it's quite important to think of sports as a multinational, because whereas international organizations like the EU, like ASEAN, like African Union, there's oversight or there's transparency there. When you deal with multinationals, there's not necessarily as much transparency. You heard, if you had the opportunity to listen to the interview I had with Dr. Krause last week, one of the things he spoke about was, the real emphasis of his job is focusing on the transparency of corporations, and the fact that most corporations are not very transparent about how they spend their money and where they spend their money in terms of what governments they're giving it to. And so the IOC and FIFA for the World Cup is very similar. They don't have a ton of transparency. and they're private corporations. They don't want to necessarily show you the books to show where all of this money is going. And so it's ripe for corruption in a way that perhaps a publicly traded multinational corporation is not. So something like Apple or Nike probably has to be a little bit more responsible because they're a publicly listed company. They're responsible to their shareholders, and they have to kind of show you this is how we balance the books at the end of the day. The IOC and FIFA, these are private organizations that don't have those same pressures. And so again, they're ripe for corruption, taking bribes from foreign governments, which has been well documented in the case of FIFA for World Cup bids. So you see a lot of entanglement between the World Cup and FIFA and these foreign governments. And so it's, like I said, it's quite interesting to see. The other part of this is hosting the Olympics and hosting the World Cup is not typically a very profitable venture. You sink a ton of cost into building the infrastructure, and then you really only recoup a fraction of that. So you can see here the most recent Olympic Games, very, very few of them, I don't think any of them have actually turned a profit. So it is, like I said, quite stunning. Salt Lake City was probably the closest one. And actually that's where actually Mitt Romney played a huge role in that 2002 Salt Lake Games. It was a complete disaster. They were completely off schedule about 12 months before, and he stepped in and really took over. And say what you will about Mitt Romney's politics, but he was an effective leader for that. And actually, I think it was one of his biggest qualifications. I thought when he ran for president, I didn't think he played that up enough, actually, that he kind of single-handedly saved the Salt Lake Games. And you can see that's the, that's the one Olympics that actually turned, was closest to turning a profit. But typically, these are not very profitable ventures. And so hosting them in developing countries, which has been an increasingly common trend. So hosting them in Brazil or for FIFA, also hosting in Brazil or hosting in South Africa or hosting in, other parts of the world, that's actually ended up hurting some of these countries even more so. Even hosting in Greece back in 2004 was a real disaster for the Greek economy and for the Greek people. So hosting in those types of countries can be really problematic in a way that hosting in the United States or London or Australia or France or Spain, you might not turn a profit, but you're unlikely to cause significant detriment to those countries' economies, even if you lose money in the process. So why do countries decide to host the Olympics, the World Cup, any of these international sporting events? First, it's just international prestige that countries want to promote themselves. The same reason countries want to host United Nations events. The same reasons they want to host different, world task force events that might be taking, the climate events, the climate accords, hosting those, hosting a UN event, hosting a UN body, okay, hosting the EU, hosting ASEAN, changing those locations all the time as those organizations do. That's a big prestige moment to say we hosted X, whatever X might be. And so there's a lot of international prestige there. And it's an opportunity for you to say, we are an international city. We have arrived, okay? And so Brazil hosting the Olympics and the World Cup back to back was really Brazil's opportunity to say, we have arrived as an international city. We are on the same standard as London and Paris and New York and Los Angeles and Moscow. We are that type of city. Now, the problem was, of course, those games for both of them were ultimately quite disastrous for the Brazilian economy, and there was a ton of corruption, and it was an absolute disaster. And I actually have some people who interacted with the Brazilian committee working on that a little bit, and that just showed the level of dysfunction that was going on, particularly behind the Olympics at that time. So it was, it kind of blew up in their face, but it was ultimately, that's why you want to do it. There's also a lagged benefit, right? So the idea is, I might not make the money back in the Olympics, but I'm going to put my city out there. I'm going to put my country out there. I'm going to put my region out there. And people sitting at home in Austin, Texas are going to be watching the Olympics, the World Cup, and they're going to see this new destination, this new city, this new country they've not seen before. And they're going to say, we should go there the next trip. Okay, we should go there. We should spend our money there. And so you hope there's a bump in tourism. You actually do typically see that. Obviously, right now with the pandemic, there's a lot of question marks about that and how eager people are going to be to travel after all of these restrictions are lifted. But it's interesting nonetheless. And then the one industry that actually does make a lot of money out of the Olympics is local business. So the businesses in Rio, in Sochi, in London, in Beijing, the local businesses that are hosting the visitors and hosting the athletes and the restaurants and the hotels, they're actually making a considerable amount of money through this process. So that is actually generating a ton of revenue. These other smaller companies, and in some cases corporations like a Marriott or a Hilton or a Hyatt for hotels, those brands are making a lot of money hosting those games, having completely full capacity, charging higher rates for 3-4 weeks in a row. So there is a huge cost benefit there for those types of entities. So how do sports ultimately affect multinationals? Well, a couple of things. One, these sports organizations and sports leagues are interacting and are negotiating with foreign governments and foreign entities, just like any other multinational corporation is that's trading a product. Okay, the product in the case here is sports, and a lot of times it takes the form of television rights. Okay, but also merchandising rights and franchising rights. All of this is kind of mixed in there. If you watch my interview with Lee Bennett from this week, you'll have an opportunity to hear him talk a little bit about the way in which golf in Asia and China specifically, and how that is kind of negotiated, and some of the political pressures that are put in place on his side. So it's an interesting interview. I encourage you to watch it if you have the chance. But like I said, they're interacting with foreign multinationals. They're interacting with governments, negotiating directly with them. In the case of certainly places like Russia and China or North Korea, where you have state-run media outlets, you are negotiating directly with a government. And in terms of that, in terms of the European Union, there are certain trade restrictions that are going to be put in place that force, the sales of merchandising or things along those lines. You're going to have to go through the EU. You're not going to go through each individual country. You're going to go through the EU and work with them on some of this stuff. So they're negotiating just like any other multinational would. They're also able to export ideas. I think that's actually quite interesting. So they're able to export these ideas into areas that other governments might not be able to get. So multinationals can get into governments and get into countries that the United States government might not be able to get into. I'll be honest, the NBA has had a lot more cultural influence on China than the United States government probably has. I mean, that's just reality, that they're able to kind of go in and export a culture, export capitalistic ideas, certainly democratic ideas to some extent, to a new audience. And yes, they can be heavily censored at times, but it's actually, I think, quite interesting to see how they're able to export Western ideas to other countries that might be reticent to embrace those ideas. And the people in those countries tend to take to those sports quite quickly, particularly in the case of the NBA in China. And then they partner with other MNCs that you're more familiar with, Nike, Reebok, Adidas, all of these kind of major sports brands, but also IBM and Apple and Dell for their technology needs. So they are a multinational just as any other corporation is. And so this just gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're looking at in terms of profit. I mean, if you were just to take the far left-hand column and black it out, and you were just looking at companies that produce an annual profit of 13, 10, 7.4, 6.3 billion dollars a year, you would be saying, well, geez, what stock exchange are they listed on? Where are they from? What's this company that's producing all of this money? Well, it's the National Football League. It's Major League Baseball. It's the NBA. It's the Indian Premier League for cricket. And so you can see the amount of money that these sports organizations are are generating on an annual basis. And then you can see where they're from. Yes, there's a lot from the United States. There's actually quite a bit from the former British Empire, essentially. The United States, India, England, Australia are the first seven spots. But you get into these different soccer leagues, Spain, Italy, France, Monaco, down towards the bottom. And if you keep going, you have Japanese baseball right there, and you have a lot of other sports that are coming in. So this is a huge business, and there's a lot of money that's at stake. And when there's a lot of money at stake, there's also economic and political consequences at stake. Just like any other multinational, these sports organizations are trying to expand. Over the last 20 years, the NBA has probably been the most aggressive in terms of expanding into China, hosting games over there, a real huge effort. Obviously, Yao Ming, who played for many, many years right down I-10 at Houston for the Houston Rockets, has been a huge ambassador. NBA Africa has been a bigger push in recent years, going back to another Rockets player, Hakeem Olajuwon, but now currently somebody like Joel Embiid for the Philadelphia 76ers. Those players coming from Africa, going back to Africa now, trying to expand the game there. This is no different than Apple or Dell or Microsoft trying to open new offices and new spaces in new countries. This is a brand that is trying to push itself out internationally. The NBA has been the most successful. The NFL's not been particularly successful. That's a very American sport. It's a very US sport, I should say. And trying to do NFL Europe, which was an idea way probably 15, 20 years ago, that failed. They do have annual games in London, and there's been some talk of whether or not they might actually have a full-time franchise in London, but I think that's pretty dicey. But trying to expand out internationally has been a real challenge for the NFL. Doesn't mean they stop trying. They're constantly trying to do that. And then on the other side, we've actually been, in the last 20 years, really overwhelmed by the English Premier League or La Liga. A lot of those soccer leagues have been much more aggressive about coming over, expanding in the US in terms of broadcasting rights, in terms of merchandising rights. And so we've seen the United States be on the other end of it in terms of a European sports league coming over and trying to get into and get a foothold in the United States. So sports and COVID-19 right now, it's been quite interesting to see this kind of impact. Obviously, one of the first indications that this pandemic was a really big deal for a lot of Americans was when the NBA decided to postpone their season indefinitely. And then the NHL followed very quickly after. A lot of European soccer leagues followed shortly after that. And you're looking well over $1 billion of combined loss in revenue. So this is a huge blow, just as we think of this being a huge blow to local businesses and the service industry, not just here in Austin, but all around the world. There's been a huge loss in the sports industry as well. The XFL, which was a new venture with ESPN, declared bankruptcy because of this, because of the loss of revenue. And you probably have seen this recently. The governor of Florida, who is not related to me at all, even though we share the same last name, he recently declared the WWE an essential business so that the WWE professional wrestling could continue to be broadcast and could continue to run. And there are certain actually broadcast implications as to why that was the case. And then if any of you are familiar with the UFC, mixed martial arts, Dana White, who is the kind of president of UFC, recently purchased a private island just to be able to host sporting events and host his events. And so he had to cancel one recently. There's another one coming up on May 8th. And again, it's just this idea of generating revenue, working with different international partners, working with different media conglomerates to try to do this. So ultimately, big picture. Sports organizations, you have to think of them as MNCs. They have an increasingly huge influence over national and international economies. The economic hit that the NBA, the NHL, that the soccer leagues are taking is having huge ripple effects. One of the articles I posted for this week, FIFA is planning a bailout actually of the soccer industry because they need, people are losing jobs, people are losing their livelihoods. This is a big deal. Commissioners of these major sports leagues should be thought of in the same way we thought of somebody like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs or these major CEOs of multinationals. And sports provides partnership as well with international organizations on humanitarian efforts. One of the things I didn't talk a lot about here is that a lot of these sports organizations will partner with UNICEF, or they'll partner with different UN agencies to do humanitarian outreach, particularly the NBA when they do outreach in NBA Africa. There's a lot of humanitarian efforts. There's a lot of goodwill. And so you're having these sports organizations working directly with, preeminent international and political organizations like the UN, like the EU, like ASEAN, to try to give back to those communities, ultimately, though, to get a foothold in those economies. And listen, you still see the exploitation of developing countries, which is a legacy of many multinationals, in that a lot of the products that are produced, merchandise that are created, the jerseys, the hats, the t-shirts, all of these things, where are they being produced? Some are being produced in the United States, but a lot are being produced in places like Singapore, Laos, Taiwan, China, Nigeria, South Africa, Botswana. It's all over. So they're trying to find the lowest point as well to turn the most maximize profits for themselves. So it's important to think about these organizations as multinationals. I know this was a little bit of a different lecture for this week, but I hope you enjoyed it. And make sure to complete your discussion thread that's due with this, that's due on Sunday the 19th. I will be posting some more videos explaining some of the upcoming assignments in a little bit more detail. Until next time, I am signing off. More importantly, my compadre back here, Kai, is also signing off. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day, and take care.